In a remote corner of the world, nestled deep within a forgotten stretch of countryside, lies a town that barely clings to existence. Wyndham, a place so small and insignificant that most maps don't bother to mark it, is the kind of town that time forgets. It sits quietly at the end of a winding road, lost among rolling hills and dense, ancient woods. The population of Wyndham rarely exceeds 1,000 souls, and the town covers a mere 2.9 square miles. Moving there from the bustling streets of Dover, it felt like I was stepping into another century, a century that I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to visit. After Dad lost his job, we packed our lives into a rusty old truck and moved to the only place where we still had family, Wyndham, New York. I spent the entire trip brooding, convinced that the only companionship I'd find in this backwater town would be with the mosquitoes and the relentless summer sun. When we finally settled into our new home at 415 Maple Lane, a nondescript house that looked like all the others on the block, I ventured out into the neighborhood. I didn't own a bike, and my skateboard skills were embarrassingly non-existent, so I awkwardly pushed my way down the road on a cheap board we had picked up at a second-hand shop. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the empty streets as I came upon a small cul-de-sac. There, on the porch of a weathered old house, sat a kid who looked to be around my age, maybe 12 or so, with a round face and thick glasses. I had no one else to talk to, so I shuffled over and introduced myself. He told me his name was Noah. Noah was the kind of kid who was always outside, unlike me, who preferred the cool, comforting glow of video games, but we both had a love for them, so we hit it off pretty well. Over the next few weeks we became inseparable, riding through the sleepy streets of Wyndham and sharing stories. But there was one thing Noah didn't tell me right away. He was obsessed with horror. I was terrified of anything that even hinted at the supernatural. Noah, on the other hand, thrived on it. His room was a museum of horror memorabilia, gruesome action figures, shelves lined with VHS tapes of every scary movie you could think of, and posters that made my stomach churn just looking at them. Every time I went over to his place, I had to brace myself for whatever nightmare-inducing scene he wanted to show me next. His favorite trick was to shove a Freddy Krueger doll in my face when I least expected it, or force me to watch The Exorcist in total darkness. Noah's room was creepy enough, even without the horror. He slept on the bottom bunk of a bed that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The top bunk was home to his gruesome collection of slasher flicks and action figures. The walls were dotted with mysterious holes, and everything had a layer of grime that added to the overall feeling of unease. Watching horror movies in that room was a special kind of torture. One day, when Noah realized I wasn't a fan of the horror movies, he switched tactics. He started telling me local urban legends instead. Most of them were about the town, but there were a few that centered around our neighborhood. I didn't believe any of them until he told me about Deadman's rise. A year into our friendship, Noah and I were riding our bikes around the neighborhood. By then he had managed to teach me how to ride a bike, which was no small feat. We were riding past an old, dilapidated house that everyone called the Meth Shack because of the unsavory characters who lived there. Noah stopped abruptly and stared down a narrow, overgrown path behind the house that sloped upward. He motioned for me to follow, and without question I did. The path was steep, covered in loose sand and rocks that made the climb treacherous. The trees loomed closer together the further we went, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out the setting sun. When we finally reached the top, we found ourselves in a clearing. The ground was littered with trash, empty cans, cigarette butts, and other unsavory items. But what really caught my eye was the line of old, weather-beaten telephone poles stretching across the hills like sentinels from a forgotten era. The scene was oddly peaceful in the fading light, and I expected Noah to try some last-ditch attempt to scare me. But instead, he turned to me with a look of grim seriousness that I had never seen on him before. "This is it. Deadman's Rise," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Deadman's Rise? Sounds like one of your stories," I scoffed. "It's not just a story, it's real," he insisted, his eyes never leaving mine. I rolled my eyes. "There's no Deadman and there's no rise. It's just a bunch of hills." He pointed to the nearest telephone pole, the one standing tall and alone between two small hills. A shallow creek ran between the hills, disappearing into the woods beyond. The pole itself seemed to loom larger and darker than the others. "His name was Jack Heller," Noah whispered. "Who?" "He's the reason it's called Deadman's Rise." With that, Noah took off down the hill on his bike, leaving me struggling to keep up. My bike was a piece of junk, and the rough terrain didn't help. The chain slipped, and I tumbled down the hill, landing in the creek with a splash. The water was cold, and it stung the cuts on my knees, but I didn't call out for help. I didn't want to seem like a wimp. When I finally managed to stand up, Noah was already at the bottom of the hill, staring up at the telephone pole with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Noah, what are you looking at?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I'd like to admit. "Jack Heller," he replied, his voice distant. "He lived in that shack over there." He pointed to a small rotting shed hidden behind an ancient oak tree. After his wife left him, he hung himself from those wires. They say his body burned so badly that there was nothing left but ashes. But if you're here at the exact time of his death, you'll end up just like him. "And when exactly did that happen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Noah just shrugged, the seriousness in his tone suddenly replaced by his usual goofy grin. "I guess we'll find out." Despite my better judgment, I agreed to meet him there the next evening. I told myself it was just to prove him wrong, but deep down, I was scared. The next day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I packed a flashlight and some snacks, then rode my bike to the clearing. Noah was already there, sitting by a small fire he'd built, roasting marshmallows like we were on a camping trip. "How long are we supposed to wait?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "As long as it takes," Noah mumbled through a mouthful of marshmallow. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. The fire crackled softly, and the sounds of the woods became eerily quiet. Noah remained fixed on the telephone pole, his eyes wide and unblinking. I was starting to nod off when I heard a sound like dry leaves being crunched underfoot, a brittle, peeling noise that echoed through the hills. My eyes snapped open, and I saw Noah staring at something high up on the pole. There, dangling from the wires, was a figure. It was barely human, a charred, twisted shape with one gleaming eye that seemed to bore into my soul. The thing that had once been Jack Heller leered down at us, its mouth contorted into a grotesque grin. Before I could react, Noah was on his bike, speeding away into the night. I scrambled to follow, but my bike chain had slipped again. I looked back at the telephone pole, and my heart nearly stopped. The figure was moving, shifting, like it was trying to climb down from its perch. I ran up the hill as fast as I could, but when I reached the top, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Noah's bike was at the base of a pole, its frame twisted and broken, and hanging above, tangled in the wires, was Noah. His body was charred, just like Jack Heller's, with his eyes bulging in horror. Clutched in his blackened hand was a melted marshmallow bag, the contents fused to his fingers. The authorities never found anything. They searched for weeks but came up with nothing. Noah's grandmother, who had always been distant and cold, passed away not long after. She spent her last days staring at an old photograph, lost in memories too painful to bear. Years later, I returned to Wyndham, haunted by the memory of that night. I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the telephone poles, wondering if it had all been a nightmare. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a small charred piece of plastic fluttering in the breeze. It was the remains of a marshmallow bag, clinging to the wire, just out of reach. Children are mysterious, aren't they? Their minds are like clay, soft and easily shaped by the hands that mold them. Yet there's one child I fear I'll never truly understand, one whose thoughts eluded even the keenest observer. These musings flitted through my mind as I stood in the dim room, the air thick with the scent of death. Crime scene tape crisscrossed the windows and doors, a grim barrier against the world outside. Forensics teams huddled over the sticky remnants on the floor, carefully collecting evidence. What lay before me was nothing short of a nightmare. The lifeless body of an 8-year-old girl lay on the ground, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, barely supported by her slender neck. Dark stains covered the floor around her, the remnants of what once flowed through her veins. Her eyes, one still open and the other vacant, stared blankly into space. Her dress was torn, and her small body showed signs of a violent struggle. Deep scratches covered her wrists, hands and fingers, marking the desperate fight she had put up. It was clear that whatever or whoever did this wanted her silenced. The horror extended beyond her. The bodies of her parents and grandmother lay motionless in the living room, each one marked by the same chilling violence. The scene was a slaughterhouse. It made my stomach churn. Broken toys, shattered glass, and overturned furniture completed the tableau of horror, turning the living room into a scene from a waking nightmare. The stench of decay was overpowering, the bodies at least 3 days old. My vision swam as nausea clawed at my throat. I had to get out, had to escape the suffocating atmosphere of death. I stumbled upstairs, hoping for some reprieve from the horror below. I found myself in what had been the child's room. Everything was eerily undisturbed, as if untouched by the chaos that had ravaged the rest of the house. All except for one thing, a small school notebook lying open on the floor. I picked it up, feeling the weight of dread settle in my chest. The pages were smeared with dried blood, the words scrawled in a frantic, desperate hand. Symbols and strange markings filled the margins, and on nearly every page there was a face, a stitched, twisted face with blackened eyes that resembled buttons. It struck a chord of familiarity, though I couldn't quite place it. A small scrap of paper fluttered out from between the pages, landing at my feet. I bent down to pick it up, my heart pounding in my ears. "Don't be afraid, dear child. I'll keep the monsters away. I'll guard you through the night and be your friend by day. But when it comes to friends, my circle is small, so please don't leave me, or my heart will fall." There was something unsettling about the rhyme. I turned the paper over, revealing a simple message. "Madame Zeva's guardian dolls, your friend till the end." An uneasy shiver crawled up my spine. I flipped through the notebook again, starting at the beginning. It started innocuously enough, with ordinary musings about school, friends, and family. But then I found an entry that caught my eye.
"Grandma gave me a doll for my birthday. It's creepy, but Mom says I can't get rid of it. I don't like its eyes."
A few pages later, another entry followed.
"I keep Grandma's doll in a drawer. It stares at me at night. It's creepy."
The entries grew more unsettling as I continued.
"The doll watches me now. Its head turns when I'm not looking. It's weird, but kind of cool. I named the doll Bella. She said we'll be friends forever. Bella doesn't like my mom, Dad, or Grandma. She says they don't understand."
The tone shifted, becoming darker.
"Bella made me mad today. She called my mom bad names. I ripped out her eye, but she didn't like that. I said sorry later. Bella is my best friend. I hate my parents. Help."
The final pages were filled with nothing but frantic scribbles and symbols, the writing descending into madness. A cold dread settled over me, wrapping its icy fingers around my spine. I had been in the room for hours, unaware of time slipping by. With a sense of urgency, I rushed downstairs, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. But the house was eerily quiet. The investigators were gone, leaving behind only the bloodstains and chaos. I scanned the room, searching for something, anything that made sense. Then I heard it. A hollow, ancient voice, feminine and chilling.
She did this to herself, you know.
My heart nearly stopped. I spun around, searching for the source. My eyes landed on the doll from the notebook, its single button eye staring blankly. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. The voice came again, seeming to emanate from the doll itself.
She did it to herself.
I felt a surge of nausea as the reality of the situation crashed over me. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. "Bella," I choked out, feeling the words stick in my throat.
Yes?
The voice was pleased, almost amused. I lost control. My body moved on its own, my hands clawing at my chest, tearing into flesh. Blood soaked through my shirt as I dug deeper, the pain unbearable, yet unstoppable.
Don't tell my secret.
Bella whispered, her voice a soft, deadly caress. And in that moment I knew there was no escape. The doll had me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. It was just lying there by the roadside, a nondescript box. Inside, a perfectly functional television set. Not top of the line, but quite nice. A sign attached to it simply read, "Free." The offer was tempting. Who wouldn't want a free TV with all the components included, no strings attached? Yet, something felt off. Why would someone leave such a valuable item for any passerby to take? Setting aside his reservations, Charlie picked up the box and took it home. By the time everything was set up, it was late. He had put in considerable effort to get it working and decided to watch a bit of TV before bed. He turned it on, the screen casting a soft glow as the sole source of light in the room. It started on a seemingly random channel, the 371. The image revealed a dimly lit living room illuminated only by an unseen light source. A tall man, likely in his late 20s, sat in the room. As Charlie watched, he noticed the man's eyes moving rapidly, left to right, up and down. After a while, the repetitive motion of the man's eyes grew monotonous, and Charlie started to examine his surroundings. The room was ordinary enough, filled with the usual furniture. A couch, a coffee table, and some knickknacks. Suddenly, two large white circular shapes appeared, darting around the man. He seemed completely oblivious to their presence. Charlie was mesmerized by these shapes, unable to look away as they moved faster and faster. Eventually, one of the shapes attacked the man, and the screen went black. Charlie might have thought the television was broken, but it flickered back on, this time showing a new scene. A large woman sat on the edge of her bed, staring at an unseen light source, her eyes darting just like the man's. Again the white shapes appeared, circling her with increasing speed. Despite his growing unease, Charlie couldn't stop watching. As before, the shapes attacked the woman, and the screen cut to black. This cycle repeated 3 more times, each scene showing different people, each ending with the same abrupt darkness. Just before the final video, a small red light blinked on at the top of Charlie's television set. The last video began to play. This time, the image was unsettlingly familiar. It was his own living room, and he was sitting there, eyes moving rapidly in front of the glowing screen. The two white shapes appeared again, faster than ever before. He couldn't tear his gaze away. Just as the shapes in the video lunged towards him, something heavy and jet black, with 2 large white eyes, pounced on him from behind. The television flickered off, leaving Charlie in complete darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent, save for his ragged breathing. He reached for the remote, hands trembling, but the television remained off. The box lay empty beside it, the sign's promise of free echoing ominously in his mind. The sensation of being watched crept over him, and he knew that whatever had come through that screen was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. It was a night like no other, a November evening in 1995, when the chill of winter clung to the air in Beijing. The streets were eerily quiet, the city wrapped in a thick, suffocating mist that seemed to swallow any sound. The only break in the silence came from the occasional gust of wind that howled through the empty streets, rattling loose signs and sending a shiver down the spine of anyone caught in its path. At a lonely bus stop, a frail old man stood, his breath visible in the cold night air. His age was indeterminate. His hunched figure and deeply lined face could have belonged to either an old man or woman. His eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and alert as they scanned the dark, empty road. He wasn't alone. A young man, perhaps in his 20s, stood a few paces away. The young man's posture was relaxed, but his eyes betrayed a sense of unease, as though he could sense the unnatural stillness in the air. The two strangers exchanged glances, acknowledging each other's presence in the only way strangers in the night do, with a nod and a fleeting look. There was no conversation between them. The silence was too thick, too oppressive. Time dragged on, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours, until finally the distant rumble of a bus engine broke the stillness. The headlights of the midnight bus 375 pierced through the fog, illuminating the deserted street as it approached the stop. The old man and the young gentleman silently boarded the bus, the doors hissing shut behind them. The bus was nearly empty, save for the driver and a female ticket collector. The old man took a seat at the front, while the young man chose a spot a few rows behind him, settling into the quiet monotony of the late-night ride. As the bus trundled through the foggy streets, the world outside the windows seemed to fade into an abyss of darkness. The only sounds were the creaking of the bus and the occasional cough from the old man. The air inside the bus was heavy, as if the vehicle itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, out of the corner of his eye, the driver noticed something, a shadowy figure standing by the side of the road, arm outstretched in a desperate plea for the bus to stop. As the bus slowed, two more figures emerged from the mist, supporting a third between them. The man in the middle looked disheveled, his clothes tattered, and his head hung low as though he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. The three figures boarded the bus, their presence immediately casting a pall over the already tense atmosphere. The ticket collector glanced at them but said nothing, her eyes wide with an unspoken fear. The two men flanked the disheveled figure, guiding him to a seat at the back of the bus. As they passed, the young man in the middle kept his head bowed, hiding his face from view. The bus resumed its journey, the quiet almost unbearable now. The old man shifted in his seat, his eyes darting nervously between the driver and the new passengers. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Then suddenly he stood up, his voice sharp and accusing. You stole my wallet!" he shouted, pointing at the young man seated behind him. The accusation was absurd, but the old man's tone was insistent, almost frantic. The young man looked up, bewildered, and tried to protest, but the old man wouldn't hear it. He insisted they settle the matter outside, away from the bus. The driver, eager to avoid any trouble, pulled over and ordered them both off the bus. The doors hissed open, and the two men stepped out onto the deserted road. As the bus pulled away, the old man's demeanor changed. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a look of grim determination. "You're lucky I got us off that bus," he said, his voice low and serious. Those 3 new passengers, they weren't human, didn't you see? They didn't have feet, they were floating, hovering above the ground. They were spirits, not of this world. The young man stared at him, a chill running down his spine. The old man's words echoed in his mind, dredging up a deep-seated fear he hadn't known was there. They both knew they had to report what they had seen, even if it meant being ridiculed. The nearest police station was just a few blocks away, and the 2 men made their way there, the old man explaining the situation to the skeptical officers. But their story was met with disbelief and condescension, until the next day, when the news broke. The final bus of Route 375 had vanished without a trace. The bus company was in a panic, the disappearance of the bus, the driver and the ticket collector sending shockwaves through the city. The authorities scrambled to find any leads, but the mystery only deepened. On the 3rd day, the bus was found submerged in a water reservoir, far from its intended route. The discovery was chilling. Inside the bus were 3 decomposed bodies, their faces contorted in terror. But the mysteries didn't end there. The bus had somehow travelled over 100 kilometres with barely any fuel in its tank, a distance far beyond its capacity. And when the tank was checked, it wasn't empty. Not of fuel anyway. It was filled with fresh blood. The bodies, though only missing for 48 hours, were in a state of advanced decomposition, as though they had been dead for weeks. Even more baffling was that no signs of tampering or foul play were found, just the eerie, inexplicable state of the bus and its passengers. The police reviewed security footage from every checkpoint, every entrance to the reservoir, but found nothing. No sign of the bus, no indication of how it had arrived there. To this day, the case remains unsolved. In the heart of the ancient fortress of Blackstone, a grim and unyielding structure perched upon the cliffs, lived Captain Alaric Thorne. Alaric was a man of iron will and colder heart, a commander whose reputation for ruthless discipline was whispered in fearful tones among his soldiers. One such soldier, young Edwin Marlowe, found himself at the sharp end of Alaric's wrath during a heated dispute that culminated in a deadly duel. With a swift thrust of his blade, Alaric ended Edwin's life, feeling a dark satisfaction as he watched the light fade from the soldier's eyes. The weeks that followed were steeped in unease. The men under Alaric's command moved like shadows, their faces drawn and their whispers haunted by Edwin's memory. Alaric paid no mind to their mutterings, his heart encased in a fortress of its own. One stormy night, Alaric retreated to his chambers, seeking solace in solitude. His brooding was interrupted by a knock at the door. To his surprise, a group of soldiers, Edwin's closest comrades, stood before him. They bore expressions of surprising camaraderie, and Alaric, ever wary, felt a flicker of hope. Had they come to see reason, to understand the necessity of his actions? They shared drinks, their laughter ringing hollow in the candle-lit room. Alaric, drinking heavily, let his guard down, reveling in the rare camaraderie. As the night wore on, the men suggested exploring the ancient dungeons beneath Blackstone. In his drunken state, it seemed a grand idea, an adventure to solidify this newfound bond. Down they went, their torches casting eerie shadows on the damp stone walls. The air grew colder, the passages narrower, and Alaric's mind swam with drink and disorientation. His legs wobbled, and soon darkness claimed him. When Alaric awoke, he found himself shackled to the cold, unforgiving floor. His wrists and ankles were bound in iron, and he laughed, thinking it a drunken prank.
"Very funny, lads,"
he called, his voice echoing in the dim chamber.
"Now set me free."
Silence answered him. Then from the shadows, Edwin's closest friend, Elias, stepped forward, a mason's trowel and mortar in hand. One by one, the other soldiers handed him bricks. Alaric's amusement turned to dread as he realized the gravity of his situation.
"Very funny,"
he said again, but his voice wavered. The men worked in silence, brick by brick, walling up the cell's entrance. Alaric's heart pounded as panic set in.
This isn't a joke, is it?
He shouted, thrashing against his bonds. The soldiers continued their grim task, their faces stony and resolute.
Stop this madness.
Alaric pleaded, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch.
I can pay you. I can reward you beyond your wildest dreams.
No one heeded his cries. The wall grew higher, each row of bricks sealing his fate. When Elias paused to meet Alaric's gaze, the commander saw no mercy, only the cold fire of retribution. As the final brick was placed, Alaric's world plunged into suffocating darkness. His screams reverberated through the dungeon, but the thick stone walls swallowed his terror. He writhed against the iron manacles, the sharp metal biting into his flesh until his wrists and ankles bled. His fingers scrabbled at the floor, nails breaking, the pain a distant echo compared to the horror consuming his mind.
Don't leave me here to die alone. Don't leave me.
But he was alone. The oppressive blackness pressed upon him, and he could no longer tell if his eyes were open or closed. Despair clawed at his sanity as he struggled to comprehend his fate. He had sentenced others to darkness, and now he was entombed in it, a fitting punishment for his cruelty. His screams faded to whispers, then silence. Time lost meaning in the unending night. Alaric's mind fractured, splintering into madness. He repeated one phrase over and over, his voice a raspy echo in the void.
I can't get out. I can't get out.